Where are we in the long emergency? I get asked that a lot by anxious people in the university lectures and stuff. My simple answer is we're in the zone. What we're seeing right now in the fall of 2010 is a kind of race between two of the conditions or circumstances that are going neck and neck to kind of put us out of business as an advanced industrial civilization. And the two of them are the fiasco in banking and money and finance and currencies, and the energy predicament. These two things have been running neck and neck, but it's beginning to look at the moment as though the money thing is pulling ahead. And the reason it's important is that this is really about what we call capital. And by the way, I really kind of object to the casual bandying around of the term capitalism, because it suggests to people that it's a political belief, that it's an ideology. And I don't see it that way at all. To me, capitalism is a set of laws that govern the behavior of surplus wealth. It doesn't matter whether you believe in Marx or George Bush or the John Birch Society. Compound interest works the same way for any of these parties. And capital is about acquiring and accumulating wealth and then deploying it for productive purposes. And the last 100-odd years have been the time of the greatest generation of wealth and capital in the history of mankind, largely associated with the fossil fuel situation, the fact that we had so much cheap, abundant energy available to us to ramp up all of these operations that created the wealth. And so there's obviously a relationship between the end of that source of cheap and abundant energy, namely, the peak oil story, and where we're going with capital and our surplus wealth and our ability to use it productively. And one of the reasons it's so troubling is that we're now in a period of wealth destruction and capital destruction. And that's largely due to the tremendous amount of accumulated debt. As an unfortunate and tragic byproduct of cheap and abundant energy, we assumed foolishly that we would have much more, we would be acquiring much more wealth in the future than is going to be the fact, because in fact we're on the downslope now of the cheap energy thing. So we will be having less productive activity, less wealth in the future, and all of this debt that we accumulated in expectation of that future wealth is actually composed of loans that will not be paid back. That it's debt that will be welched upon. And unfortunately, as that occurs, it tends to destroy capital. And as capital is destroyed, you're losing the ability to invest in future things that will help your society. So, the bottom line is that so many of the things that we're hoping and wishing that we can ramp up to have a post-oil, post-fossil fuel economy are based on the assumption that there would be a lot of capital there to finance it. That capital is now leaving the system. And it's going to create additional problems, especially in the oil and fossil fuel sector. It's going to make that sector much less predictable, much more difficult to carry on. The money that we hoped we could assign to oil exploration and the development of whatever future oil there is out there, which, by the way, appears to be rather scanty. We're not really finding very much new oil, but even the stuff we have found, even the stuff that's in the difficult places to develop, like the deep water off of Brazil or the Gulf of Mexico, even these places are going to be short on capital investment. And, the bottom line of that is that the oil industry and the fossil fuel industry is going to probably wobble and destabilize and possibly even crash more efficiently and sooner than we had expected. So there's this relationship between capital and money and debt and finance and the whole energy situation. It seems not that hard to understand to me. And by the way, I have no training in economics whatsoever, but you don't have to be a trained economist to figure this out. And in point of fact, no one has gotten this more wrong conceptually than the trained professional economists at the highest PhD, highest Department of the Treasury level. They understand it the least. The people in the elite Ivy League schools appear to understand it the least. And I'm not saying this, for the sake of self-aggrandizement. It's actually what's going on. It's one of the paradoxes of our time, and along with all the other intellectual noise in the system right now, it's amazing that there is so much paradoxical ignorance among people who ought to know better in our society. Right now we're in a situation where debt is not being repaid at all levels: the household, the government, the enterprise level. And as that occurs and works out, we're going to be in a compressive, deflationary depression, in which there is simply less and less money. At the same time, we're going to see strange things happening in prices, and I'm not sure that the conventional methods for pricing things is going to really clarify the picture for economists or for the general public, because they're going to see weird things happening, I think. For example, I believe that the prices of many assets will go down, like stocks or houses, property, etc. Whereas the prices of many immediate necessities like food and fuel and stuff like that are liable to go up. So there'll be a lot of contradictory signals going on. Right now there has been a huge ongoing debate between people who call themselves the inflationists and the people who are the deflationists, and I'm sort of in the middle. I recognize the dangers of both and the potential for both, and I guess I don't really have that firm an idea of how it's going to play out. Although, if someone pushed me to take a stand, I'd say, well, we're probably going to be in a deleveraging deflation for a while. Maybe 6 months, 18 months, 24 months, maybe 2-3 years. Who knows? Something like that. And then, we have the possibility of our currency failing. There are problems with that, and there's a reason why I don't have a really firm, idea of forecasting how that works out. One of them is that hyperinflation, in which currency becomes valueless, is a phenomenon that tends to take place very quickly. It tends to take place very rapidly, where you get a sudden acceleration of the velocity of money, meaning that people are spending money really quickly to get rid of it. To buy as much stuff as they can as quickly as they can, because they're getting the feeling that maybe the value of the money is going down so sharply and so quickly that they better get rid of it. And as that occurs, historically, it tends to be a very rapid phenomenon and some kind of a traumatic and catastrophic phenomenon. So I'm not, it's hard for me to see hyperinflation as something that's going to drag out. So, what we could see really instead is deflationary behavior with all of a sudden, a sudden hyperinflationary event that seems to come out of nowhere and can come out of nowhere. If, let's say, one sovereign bond fails in Europe, or some weird banking, fiasco occurs anywhere. Or there's a geopolitical oil problem. The Straits of Hormuz get closed, or there's a war between Israel and Hezbollah, whatever. There are more and more reports coming out from places mostly other than the United States, basically informing the public of the developed world that we've got a problem. And it's, the problem that I've just described, a combination of energy and problems with capital and wealth combining to suggest that we may be going out of business. And the most recent report came from the German military, and it was a very comprehensive report that went beyond the mere questions of how the military was going to get oil and gasoline and run a modern military the way it's designed to run, but it went into many of the really civilian economic questions of how you just run an economy, in particular a global economy that's very intertwined. And the conclusion that they came to was that economy is going to run into an awful lot of trouble and is actually liable to fail as these mutually reinforcing instabilities mount. And as that happens, they will tend to amplify and reinforce each other on an accelerating basis, so that before you know it, you're really out of business doing all kinds of things, whether it's the global movement of large quantities of merchandise, or the global movement of oil, which is a system that is incredibly fragile. And all you have to do is look at the map and see what the Straits of Hormuz are all about. Where the Persian Gulf necks down between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or where the Red Sea, where the Red Sea leads to the Suez Canal. And if you have any notion of map reading and geography, you very quickly come to understand the fragility of the oil situation, of the oil transport situation. So the German military got it right, but we've had other reports from Lloyd's of London, from the University of Kuwait, from the United Kingdom Energy Department or Ministry, really just about everywhere but the authorities in the United States, who for some mysterious reason cannot bring themselves to recognize the problems of peak oil and to articulate them clearly to the public. And what is appearing to be the incredible irresponsibility of this is going to bite us back. I'm fond of saying that I'm allergic to conspiracy theories, and I am, because I don't think, first of all, people can't keep secrets. I mean, the idea that 138 people in the Department of Energy could keep a secret, I mean, it's absurd. I think the explanation is fairly simple. I do believe in sort of the law of reasoning called Occam's razor, which states that the simplest explanation is probably the most likely one. And I think the most likely explanation is simply that the subject is too painful for American political leaders, and they have basically put the word out that we really don't want to articulate this. We don't want the Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, talking about this, even though he should know better. The problem is it ends up being kind of infectious and pernicious. And in effect, it gives permission to all kinds of people to either be delusional about our energy situation or to be silent about it. And neither of those things is good. And it's infectious even in this way that is, to me, was shocking. I have gone to the Aspen Environmental Forum for a couple of years in a row. And this is the cream of the environmental movement, the most well-known and credentialed and exalted environmental green people in America. And, at some point or another, they will get into the subject of, we've got an energy problem and, we've got this car dependency problem. What are we going to do? Invariably, the conversation turns to only one thing: running the cars heroically by other means. We'll run it on ethanol, we'll run it on natural gas, we'll have electric cars, we'll have hybrids. This is the elite of the environmental movement. They don't want to talk about walkable neighborhoods. They don't want to talk about smaller cities that function in an integral way. They don't want to talk about other means of transportation, like getting our railroad system ramped up again, or moving more stuff on water, or the truck being the last part of the journey, not the whole journey. They don't want to talk about any of that. And what this tells me is, it's such a striking intellectual failure. It's such a striking failure of this culture to have a coherent conversation from the people who ought to be leading it. Because if those people can't talk coherently about car dependency in relation to our oil situation, who are we going to depend on? The people who go to NASCAR? I don't think so. So the fact that there's no leadership at the top down from President Obama or the Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu or the Secretary of Transportation or our leaders in the legislatures and the various Congresses and Senates, all and at every level of government. And it's not coming from the media. And by the way, it's not just because the mainstream media is bought off or that there are a bunch of lackeys to some undefined conspiracy. They're just doing a bad job. The editors are doing a bad job of assigning the stories and understanding the issues, and the reporters are getting poor leadership from their editors and their producers. That's why it's not on CNN, or that's why the New York Times is doing a terrible job of reporting this. And unfortunately, history is tragic, and history doesn't care if we're incompetent. History doesn't care if we make blunders. History doesn't care if we're sloppy. History doesn't care if we don't pay attention. Reality has mandates of its own. And, we're going to find out the hard way what the cost of not paying attention is. I think the stresses in our society now are so rich and manifold and thoroughgoing and well distributed that there's certainly no shortage of things to worry about and feel aggravated about and be angry about. And, my take on it is that this is a very emotionally upset nation right now, and I'm quite sure that it's going to get worse because economic distress is certainly going to prompt, if nothing else, a lot of wishful thinking and delusional thinking and scapegoating and the misplacing of negative emotion onto other things and other people. So it's not a very good recipe for social cohesion. What I've noticed about the people who I do think have a firm grasp on the reality of the situation is that they tend to predict things happening a little bit too early. That's been my experience of kind of a uniform, let's say, a uniform kind of flaw for this cohort of people who otherwise I think are very, very clear about how they see the world and its consistency with the reality of the world. But a lot of us have called for things which are on an obvious trajectory, but one element of this story is the impressive ability of our economic system and political system to levitate, to keep on going with no obvious way of supporting itself other than sheer faith or wishing. Just the wish to keep on going seems to be enough to keep it levitating a little bit longer. And that's certainly true of the economic side of the picture, since so many of the money issues depend really on a consensual collective agreement that our money means something, that we're productive, and that there's some relationship between what we do in this society and the abstract markers that we use to represent wealth, like currencies and stock certificates and bonds and all these things. So there you go. Well, I think people actually get me wrong. I'm not a science person. I'm not a tech person. I'm basically a prose artist. That's how I started out, even from the beginning of my career out of college as a journalist. I started out as a feature writer, and I wasn't interested in reporting the news. I was interested in writing funny stories about strange things and strange people. And I'm much more concerned with the composition of my prose than I am necessarily with the stuff that I'm reporting on. Although it happens to have coincided that I'm living in a certain time in history when really momentous things are occurring. And it also happens that I developed a point of view that seems to help people articulate what is going on. The two books that I wrote after The Long Emergency were attempts to create a vivid fictional picture of what life might be like in the USA, some years hence, maybe 15, 20 years, give or take. And, I was much more interested in the textures of what that life would be like and how people would experience it as a sensory matter than I was with informing them about stuff. I had no intention of being didactic or, instructive. My book, The Long Emergency, and the previous ones about the fiasco of suburbia, they were didactic enough. They were instructive enough. And, I certainly go around doing enough lectures to colleges and talks in conferences like the one that we're here for in Dearborn, Michigan. Where when it comes to actually putting stuff on the page, I'm much more interested really in the artistry of it. It's as simple as that. How do I see religions playing into the future? Well, that happens to be a big theme in the World Made by Hand novels. And at the center of these novels is a cult of evangelical Christians called the New Faith Brotherhood that's moved up. I've written this story in which this cult has moved from Virginia and from what I imagine to be the social disorders and political disorders of the Sun Belt, and they've moved north to find some peace and tranquility. And they've ended up in this small town in kind of a backwater of upstate New York, in a little corner of the state near the Vermont border, and they actually buy the high school, which has been deactivated. They don't use the high school anymore in this town because the population's gone down so much. So this group, the New Faith Brotherhood, moves in, and they begin to sort of clash with the local population of the regular people in town. And all these books have at their center this clash in worldviews between a group of religious people who are kind of acquiring a semi-medieval, superstitious view of the world, and this group of regular townspeople who kind of retain all the baggage of the Enlightenment, science and technology, at least as ideas. They don't have the technology anymore, but they have all of the baggage of, logical positivism and empiricism. It's disappointed them hugely, but they haven't let go of it. And so there's a collision between this new kind of supernaturalism and the old, 20th century science and tech view of the world being rational. And a lot of people read these books and complained to me that they didn't get the supernatural elements in the book. And it's as simple as that, it's a matter of worldview. And I'm not saying that reality has changed. I'm not saying that the world is necessarily more magical, but it's perceived that way. And so what I'm really imagining is the re-enchantment of the everyday world. I think it's sort of amusing and a little bit galling that people label me as a doomer. I am describing a situation that is going to be interesting, to say the least, as it plays out. But I think that there will be a lot of collateral benefit for us. I think we're going to recover activities and skills that we left behind. I think that we're going to be spending more time in direct relationships with other people and with things in nature and the world around us in a way that will be much more satisfying to us than the mediated existence that we've been swindled into by the people who are selling us all the mediated equipment and gadgets and stuff. We're gonna grow our own food because we have to grow our own food, not just because the cheese doodles aren't out on the shelf anymore. We're going to be working with our neighbors at things that matter, shoulder to shoulder, because the cubicle jobs won't exist anymore. We're going to be making our own music because the canned entertainment is going to be a thing of history. We may not even have the playback equipment working the way we were used to working it, So these things, I think, are going to have a lot of kind of sideways collateral benefits for us. I think there's one other thing, though, that's pretty important. It's a little dark, perhaps, but nonetheless, I think it's what's coming. And it's what I would call a timeout from modernity. We need a timeout. We need a rest. We're talking about the depopulation of Detroit that's been ongoing for 40 years. And a number of people have sort of picked up this trend and said, okay, well, these neighborhoods and blocks are being deactivated and depopulated. Let's turn them into farms. Personally, I actually think that this is the wrong way to think about the city and about urbanism and about Detroit in particular, although I recognize that places go through transitional periods of history. And it may be the short-term or medium-term destiny of Detroit to turn into a set of gardens and little farmettes. You saw a similar thing happen, by the way, in Rome, which went from being a city of about 1 million people in the time of Hadrian to a town of maybe 10,000 or something in the 11th century. And where the great metropolitan city of Rome had existed in the time of Trajan and Hadrian, people were just grazing sheep in what had been the forums, and and growing artichokes and that may be a similar destiny for Detroit. But I like to caution people that of a number of things. First of all, cities exist where they do because they occupy important sites. Detroit will probably never be the Detroit of 1959 again, but there will be an important settlement there. And under the best circumstances, it will be some kind of a good urbanism, maybe a wonderful urbanism, but it will be an urbanism. And it's important to keep in mind, there's nothing wrong with the urban garden, and there's nothing wrong with gardening, but in fact, the idea that Detroit should turn into a farm is a misunderstanding of landscape based on the confusions of suburbia. Because what happened was, suburbia destroyed the distinction between what is urban and what is rural. Under the regime of suburbia, everything became one big mishmash. And that we haven't lost that yet. We don't have a firm sense of what's urban and rural. I think that what you're going to find that really the best outcome of this would be for Detroit to re-densify and re-urbanize at its old core, mainly the part along the Detroit River, which is a kind of strait between two Great Lakes, and for the agriculture to properly take place on the fringe, on the urban fringe. That's where the agriculture really belongs. And unfortunately, the urban organism that Detroit is probably going to be in the future will be a much smaller one than it is now. And the fringe is currently occupied by the great, immense suburbs of Detroit, which really represent a lot of paved over agriculture. So how that's going to come back, we don't know. But I would caution people to think about this a little more deeply. The destiny of Detroit is not to become a farm. I understand people's feelings about wanting to do something productive with what's there and salvaging what's there and allowing the people who continue to live there at the moment to continue living. There's nothing wrong with gardens. But on the whole, I wouldn't give them 4 stars for really thinking this through. The 3 things I would tell people to do that are probably most urgent right now is we have to start directing our dwindling remaining capital into the project of relocalizing our activities in America and downscaling them to a scope and scale and size that is consistent with the energy realities of the future. And these activities include the way we grow our food, the way we do commerce, the way we do transportation, the way we organize our habitations on the landscape, and many other subgroups like medicine, education, et cetera, et cetera. And banking, by the way, because that's going to have to rescale too at a smaller and more local scale in some cases. The next thing I think that is terribly important is we got to rebuild the existing railroad system in America. And I'm not suggesting high-speed rail, because that's something that probably ain't going to happen. It requires too much capital. The legal obstacles are too cumbersome in the way of acquiring the rights of way through eminent domain, because the property is too much of the property is going to be fought over. So, and you need an entirely new set of parallel tracks to run high-speed rail on. You can't run it on the regular tracks. It requires different curve ratios and grades and everything. So we need to get the regular trains going. And if we don't do it, we're not going anywhere in America, because the motoring system is going to go down, and the commercial aviation system is not going to be working the way we're used to it. So we either get hip to the rail thing, or we're going to be in big trouble. The third thing probably is really part of one of the other ones, which is we have to use the ideas of relocalization and downscaling as our primary context or frame of reference for understanding all of the tasks on our to-do list that we have to do. What should people invest their money in? That's a very, very tricky thing, and I am not a qualified investment advisor. And there are downsides to all of the ones that we generally know about. A lot of people are going into gold because gold is thought to be a safe haven from both inflationary and hyperinflationary events, and from sheer uncertainty about where currencies are going and the value of any money. So people are going into gold. There are some figures out there who people listen to, like the arch deflationist Robert Prechter, who predict that the price of gold as an asset will actually go down along with other assets. I don't know if he might be right. There are an awful lot of other people, I think his name is George Sprott. Is it George Sprott? Who of the Sprott Gold Fund, who believe that gold is basically a haven from uncertainty, and the price of it is going up, up, up. The evidence till now is that the price of gold is going up. It's just, in the fall of 2010, gold has made a striking move past its prior highs, and it's in new uncharted territory. But, I'm also a fan and a follower and a believer in Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the author of The Black Swan. And Mr. Taleb, a rather grumpy, kind of irascible character, but certainly a very interesting one. His main point in his work is that we can't really be certain about anything, and that most of the people who pretend to know about what's going to happen actually know a lot less than they pretend to. And, I think there's a lot to what he has to say, even if it means I have to be skeptical of my own ideas. So I would drag Mr. Taleb into the arena as a cautionary figure that, whatever we're so sure of, may be completely a made-up narrative in our own heads, or a meme that's floating around that, that is not supported by reality. There are a lot of people who have rational investment plans for peak oil, and one of the ideas out there is get into cash right now, because other investments are so uncertain that cash may actually continue to be the one thing that at least holds its value. Prechter's among them, by the way. And that you should wait until the end of this deflationary workout and then buy assets that have fallen really far down, especially things like, stocks that represent companies that make things that people really need, like soap or, tools or something like that. Myself, I'm not all that sanguine about the future of corporate enterprise, period. I'm not really sure that a lot of these companies are going to necessarily make it through whatever bottleneck that we're going through. So, I'm not that hot on conventional investments. It certainly may be a good idea for people in this position to buy tools, to buy productive farmland if they can get it. It's not that cheap now, but we're in right now in a situation where real estate is losing value. Even good productive farmlands, where I live in the, upstate New York, there's quite a bit of good farmland that's just lying around, and it's really rather cheap. So that's one thing. You can put it under your mattress. One thing I wouldn't do is, buy blue chip stocks or NASDAQ tech stocks, or, I'd stay out of the S&P, and I don't know. It's a lot of people have already lost their savings and their retirements, or at least a portion of it, and I think there's a very good chance that they're going to lose much of the rest. The thing that is hardest for us to do at the moment is to come up with a consensus about reality that is consistent with the way things really are going. To come up with a coherent picture of what's happening to us and what we're going to do about it. And, the noise in the system, in the form of so many people's ideas and opinions about what's happening, and so many memes and narratives and stories that are floating around there, along with wishes, hopes, delusions, and other not helpful intellectual material, is making it very hard for us to articulate where we are in this point in human history and what we're going to do.
Please come back and watch complete interviews with each of the experts. And you can join me, Tom Hartman, anytime on the web at tomhartman.com.